Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosen Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about the IMF and the World Bank annual meetings, which always happen towards the end of October. Brunello, you've attended these meetings, I think, for the zillionth year in a row. They're a crucial sort of touch point of all the leading macroeconomists, public policy professionals in the public sector. I mean, what came out of it? And we saw this sort of key figure get announced every year about growth and about inflation. What did you hear through the grapevine at the meeting itself?
Yeah, so the IMF meetings are always a good occasion to get a pulse of the situation, and they are somehow always summarized by the main publications such as the WEO, the World Economic Outlook, and the Global Financial Stability Report. If you look at the WEO, the key components are, if you want, the growth and inflation forecast plus some policy recommendation. So if you look at the growth forecast, um, growth is the good news somehow is growth is expected to remain relatively constant at current levels. The bad news is that this level is pretty low, 3.2% in 2024 and 2025. And in some low income and developing economies, actually, there's been quite a sizable downward revision to growth, which means that to some extent, larger economies compensate, and among them clearly the US. In fact, US GDP is expected to remain strong at 2.8% this year, potentially reverting back in 2025. The Eurozone, instead, we know we remain relatively weak around potential. The problem is that potential growth in the Eurozone is weak. Germany is 0.5, Italy is lower than that, France is slightly higher. The Eurozone as a whole doesn't reach 1%, which is kind of a big difference compared to the US. But vice versa, emerging markets have a slightly more positive outlook around 4.2% growth this year and next. But clearly, these are smaller economies growing, so it's kind of normal that they have this kind of growth rate.
Yeah. And it sort of reminds me of a key figure floating around in the media last week, which is if you look at the American states, Mississippi is the state with the lowest growth, but Mississippi still has higher growth than France, than Germany, than Italy, than the UK. So there's a sort of increasing disparity between Europe and the US. How are labor markets doing? Are they also shown to be just as resilient?
Yeah, Mississippi is interesting. Is GDP per capita, and is the poorest state in the US, is higher of those of the Eurozone economies, of
Hmm.
the best performing, and even the UK. This is quite alarming, clearly, when you adjust for prices, so so-called PPP, purchasing power parity. The story is slightly different, clearly, because the cost of living in Mississippi is not as high as London. But it's still alarming that there's such a huge disparity in GDP per capita between the US and the Eurozone and Europe in general. On the good news is the labor markets have remained resilient across the globe for a variety of reasons. So the unemployment rate is close to lowest level on record, even in Europe, 6.4%. And actually, inflation is finally a good story. There was a spike, as we all know, unfortunately, from 23, 22 even, a couple of years of spiking inflation that central banks have to fight with higher interest rates. But this fight has paid off. So inflation at global level after peaking around 9.5% at the end of 2022 is now expected to be around 3.5% at the end of 2025, and in some countries, clearly, especially the largest developed economy, lower than that. In the Eurozone, 1.7, in the UK, below 2%, in the US is approaching percent. So, the battle, as the IMF says, has been largely won. Then if you move to the policy side, that's the more interesting bit, I would say, because the IMF sees three key pivots to be made. So the first one is that monetary policy doesn't need to be as restrictive as before, exactly because the battle against inflation has been largely won. In fact, a number of central banks have already cut interest rates. Some of them, such as the Fed, by more than expected 50 basis points in September. The ECB has cut three times already, so in June, September, and October. And the BOE has also already cut in August, expected to do so next week. So that's, as a policy recommendation, doesn't need to be provided to some extent because most central banks have already embarked. The second one is a bit more interesting, is consolidation of the fiscal position to reduce the huge amount of public debt that has been created in the last few years as a result of growing deficits. Those deficits were created to combat, first of all, the pandemic and then the effects of the energy shock deriving from the war in Ukraine. Now, this is a policy recommendation instead that needs to be given because most countries are thinking of doing that, maybe not doing that. And the country is now even thinking about the US is a good example. There's no fiscal restraint in sight. If you look at both candidates, they are both promising a larger deficit and a higher debt, as there was no tomorrow. And the dollar would never absorb these higher deficit and debt. Is an assumption that has been working so far. It's not going to necessarily work forever. Third pivot is on structural reforms. This is not generally the space for the IMF, it's the OECD that generally bashes governments of structural reforms, but they think in this case it was warranted. Reforms are needed to increase the productivity of countries, hence their growth potential, in order to reduce the GDP issues over time in a slightly less, how can I say, cumbersome way for populations, because fiscal restraints can be very painful, as we have learned from the UK budget yesterday. 40 billion of extra money going to the government instead of staying in the economy. So, it's a recommendation that is very much needed, I would say.
Yeah. Seems like these sort of three pivots are going to define much of central banking policy in the greater posture, at least for 2025, if not for the term beyond that. And such an interesting coincidence of the UK budget coming in as well, announcing some of these things that some in line, some not so much. But an interesting sort of update to be had again in the sort of spring meetings, I believe the IMF will have in just a few months. So as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.